Hey, this is Jeremy from Production Den. So glad to have you with me on the channel today. Today we're going to be talking about some tips for working in the mixer inside of FL Studio. I don't know about you, but for me, one of the things that I want to do with all of my song productions is make sure that I have the fastest workflow that I can so that I can get music done quickly, get it done well, and get it out so that people can enjoy it and listen to it. So today we're going to be talking about a couple of different tips that will help speed up your workflow in the mixer in FL Studio. But before we jump into that, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. If you aren't already, turn on the notification bell so you get alerted when there's new videos. Now let's jump in. So I'm going to cover a couple of very fundamental things about the mixer first, such as taking tracks from your channel rack and routing those to the mixer tracks, and then also how to pick out plugins and associate it with those mixer tracks. But then I'll start getting into some other tips and tricks that'll help speed up your workflow in the mixer. So I'm gonna press F6 and bring up the channel rack. And what you'll see here is I have two bass channels, and I have a synth bass and I have a VST bass that I have rendered out for this project. So the first thing that I'm gonna do to route a single channel is I would click on that channel so that it's highlighted green beside the channel that I wanna route. I'll press F9 to bring up the mixer. I'm gonna select the track on the mixer, the insert track that I wanna use, and then I'm gonna press Control and L. And what you'll see happens is that it associates that synth bass with that track number inside the mixer, and it also picks up the color and it picks up the name that was on the track. But if I had more than one track and I wanted to lay them down side by side, so I wanted to do these at the same time, I could hold down Shift in the channel rack, select both of those so the green boxes beside them are selected, and then I would go back to the mixer, pressing F9. I would select that first channel, and then I would press Control, Shift, and L. And what you'll see happens is it lays out both of those tracks side by side, and again, picks up the names of those files and routes those correctly. If you want to route multiple things to a single track, just leave out the shift. So if you had 3 or 4 audio files that you wanted to route to the same mixer track, you could pick those 3 or 4 audio files, select the one insert on the mixer track that you want to use, and then just press Control L, leave out the shift, and it'll make all 3 of those all 3 of those files go to that same mixer track. So now we have these two things in the mixer themselves, and now we're going to move on to creating a bus track. So for this, I'm going to select both of these tracks at the same time. So I'll hold down Control and Shift, and then I'll left click on that track, and that'll let me select both of them. And the neat thing about when you have these Control Shift selected all together, when you start adjusting the volume, you're adjusting both of them at the same time. So they'll stay similar to each other relative to how much you're moving the fader up and down for just one of them. So let's say for this track, you like the balance down here, and then you Control Shifted everything, and you move those faders, it's gonna keep that volume relatively the same between those two things, which is a nice feature to have on this. So now that we have both of these selected, Control and Shifted, I'm gonna come down here to this arrow down at the bottom of the next track. I'm gonna right click it, and I'm gonna say route to this track only. And what that's gonna do for both of those channels, you'll notice down at the bottom that it took away the arrow that went to the master track, and it just pushed it to this track right here. So we're gonna set this one up as the bus. So I'm gonna set this up as bass bus. I'm gonna left click here. I'm gonna select a color that's fairly similar to that yellow. And then I'll also come over here and I'll select a bus icon. So multiple tracks coming down into one, just so that I know that it's a bus track. The synth bass and the VST bass are both routed to the same bus track. And this bus track is still routed out to the master. And the advantage of this is if I decide that I want to process those bass tracks together before I send them to the master, I can do that through that bus track. So now let's talk about actually bringing in plugins underneath of each of these insert tracks. So I'm clicking on the first channel, which is channel 12, and I'm gonna come over here to the slot that's on the right side. And for this one, I'm just gonna go ahead and bring up an EQ. And then I'm gonna also bring up a limiter, but we're gonna use the compression side of the limiter. So I'm gonna click on compression. That'll open up the compression controls over here. And then let's say I have one more effect. Let's say we just use a little bit of a distortion that we're gonna put on there. And I probably won't use much distortion on this, but it's just an example, so don't flip out in the comments. So now, if I come under this EQ and I decide that I actually want to make sure that I do a certain number of settings for this channel, and I set up this EQ, and I like this EQ, and I want to make sure that my other bass channel has a similar EQ where I've already gone through and done the settings for this particular channel, then what I can actually do is come up here to this drop down arrow, and I come to the save preset as, and you'll see there's an icon beside the save preset. And if I left click and drag it, it will allow me to drag that EQ into another channel. So if I drop it down on the Rickenbacker bass channel now, you'll see that that EQ, the same one that was underneath of the synth bass, has been copied over to the Rickenbacker bass as well. And now let's say that I really like the entire plugin chain that I'm using for my synth bass. I could actually come over here, right click on the channel so it brings up this menu, go down to File, and then save mixer preset as, or mixer track state as, and there's another icon over there. So now if I left click and drag that onto the Rickenbacker bass, you'll see that it copied every one of those plugins. So now I have the same EQ, the same compression, and the same distortion that was on the synth bass. I've transferred that over to the VST bass as well. I think one of the quickest ways to move around in the mixer is actually to use the scroll wheel on your mouse. So if you come up here to this top section above these knobs, and you just use your scroll wheel, it'll let you go back and forth really quickly around your mixer. Be careful though, if you go down to these knobs and you do that, you'll see that it starts messing with things like the pan. But if you hold down Alt and then click that knob, it'll reset it to what it was initially. So just make sure that as you're scrolling along that you don't screw up the panning on some of your different channels. And let's say I have a situation where I actually just want to get rid of everything that was on a particular channel. I could come in here and right click on the channel and then come down to this option that says reset selected tracks to default. And if I do that, it'll ask me to say okay to it, but then what it's gonna do is it's gonna remove all the plugins, and it will remove the naming and the coloring of that channel mixer track, and then it'll be back to a blank state, a default state. But the thing that you'll notice is that it doesn't reset the actual routing of the channel. So you'll see that it's still routed over here to the bass bus. And sometimes what happens for me in a project is I'll realize that I need to maybe throw in an extra track or a few extra tracks into the mixer, and I want to arrange them in a certain way. I want to put them in a certain spot. So let's say I need to drag 2 more empty mixer tracks over to this bass section because I added in some new bass stuff. So I'm going to come over here, scroll over to some of these blank tracks. I'm gonna click on the first one and then Control and Shift and click on the second one. So now I have 2 tracks selected, and if I press down Alt and then use my left arrow on my keyboard, I can then bring these things over where I want those blank tracks to be. So now I've added in these 2 extra tracks for the bass that I wanted to make sure that I added in so that I could do some extra clips in there. And once I've gotten everything routed together, one of the things that I sometimes like to do is to take all of the bus tracks and then dock them over to a certain side of the mixer. So let's say I want to dock this bass track over to the left side of the mixer. So if I right click on it and then I come down here to dock and say left, it's gonna dock this bus track over to this left side with the master, the instrument bus, and now the bass bus is in there. But what that does is as you're scrolling around, you'll see that that stays on that left side and it's always available. So let me take you through one more scenario. One thing that's really helpful is if you have multiple audio files, like multiple takes of a particular instrument for a song that you have combined together and put into one mixer track. Sometimes it's helpful if you can just render out that track to one solid audio file instead of having the 3 separated files. So let's pretend for the minute that in this playlist up here that these 3 takes are separate audio files. of this bass that I worked on for the project, and that all of those tracks were placed into this track 13. So 3 separate audio clips are all put into track 13. If I come down here to this dot and I right click on it and I select, let's call it bass render, and make a note of where it's actually saved in hard drive, say okay, and now you'll see that it's armed red. So it's ready to record, but what we're gonna do is actually render it out. So if we come up here, drag this up a little bit, so you'll see this blank track right here. If we press Alt and R, it's going to bring up the render menu. And in this menu, I'll have a couple options. For this particular rendering, I'm gonna say full song, which is the default for this, leave the remainder on it, and I want to leave the rest the same, and then I'll press start. So you see up here, bass render popped up in the playlist, and now I could come back into the project and go ahead and delete these other clips. And then if I came out to the channel rack, and you'll see that it showed up down here at the bottom of the playlist, or at the bottom of the channel rack, and then I can associate that with whatever mixer track that I want to. One thing to note though is if I want to associate this with a mixer track, if you put it back in here into the track that it was already associated with, it will be like doubling up on the plugins. So it will put it back through all those plugins, because when you rendered it, it rendered it with all of those plugins. So you may want to render your audio before you get to the place that you want to put effects on it. Or you could just come down here and put it into a new channel by using that same Control and L to put it into a new place. Well, hopefully that was helpful for you to be able to see a couple of different tips and tricks that can speed up your workflow inside of FL Studio. If you have any comments or questions about the tips and tricks that I shared, please leave those in the comment section below. Or if you have some tricks that you want to share with the rest of the community, please leave those in the comment section below. If you like this video, I have another video where I show you in depth how I prep for a mix in a song project, and you can click on that here. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next round.